His research emphasis has been on the disturbance of ecology and coastal ecosystems, and his research is presently focused on developing a better understanding of the potential effects of changes in hydrology, water quality, and the exploitation levels of the coastal communities of South Florida, which of course is a huge impact for us. And Diego's been a really integral, important part of the Citizens Science Project from its inception almost 3 years ago.
Going on 3 years, yeah.
And we thank him very much for being here this evening. So,
Thank you. Don't clap before I do anything. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. It's a really good turnout, and I'm happy that everybody's here. I'll be presenting today on the second half of the work that I do. If you were here for my previous lecture, you saw me presenting on coral reefs and coral reef restoration. Today, I will be presenting on the other type of research that my lab does at the University of Miami, where I'm an associate professor at the MBE Marine Biology and Ecology department. So before I start, I want to find out how many of you guys, give me a show of hands, how many of you guys know what seagrasses are?
It's grass in the sea.
Just show of hands, how many of you guys know what a seagrass is? Okay, so I have my work cut out for me. Hopefully, I fully understand why you don't know what seagrasses are, but hopefully towards the end of this lecture you will know why you need to know what seagrasses are. Okay, some facts before we start. And if you guys have any questions, unless they're super important, save them until the end. Okay? So seagrasses are pretty much like the grasses you see in your lawn. They are flowering plants. They are the only flowering plant that's found completely submerged in the oceans. Okay? They are found throughout the world, even under the polar ice caps. So they're found pretty much everywhere, from our backyard all the way to the higher and lower latitudes. As a group, they have very low diversity. We're talking about roughly 50 to 60 species. That's just very low diversity compared to some of the other really important ecosystem builders like corals and coral reefs, which have, corals have roughly 1,000 species, mangroves 60 to 100, seagrasses just a few species. So not a very diverse, but a very important component of coastal ecosystems. They are critical to the function and structure of local ecosystems. They are threatened. Some species are actually listed locally as threatened, and we'll talk about that later. And they provide essential habitat to a whole bunch of very important macro and microfauna that we found here in Key Biscayne and elsewhere in the Caribbean. More importantly, when we're talking about climate change and the impacts of climate change over time, seagrasses are very key carbon sinks. They soak up a lot of carbon and store it in a way that's not available, so they don't affect acidification. In fact, they benefit the oceans by trapping carbon. So we'll talk about that later. So these are all the facts that you guys should know by the end of this lecture. One of the problems that seagrasses have, and that's why you guys don't know, many of you don't know what seagrasses are, is that they have very poor PR. The seagrass lobby is not doing a really good job. Everybody knows about corals. Everybody knows about mangroves. Very few people know about seagrasses. If you just look at the number of mentions or publications of seagrass in black compared to some of the other coastal communities or habitats like salt marshes, mangroves, and corals, you see that seagrasses are always low. The New York Times rarely covers seagrass. A week cannot go by without a coral reef story in the New York Times. So there's something going on here. They're very important. They're crucial, critical habitats, but nevertheless, they don't get a lot of coverage. They are, nevertheless, very beautiful habitats. If not the seagrasses themselves, the organisms that are commonly found within seagrass habitats, manatees, barracudas, and other small fish, sharks, they are really beautiful communities. So if you haven't had a chance to go out and visit some of these shallow environments, please do so. They're easy access. All you have to do is just wade into the nearshore environments of Key Biscayne and elsewhere within South Florida, and you will see very beautiful, vibrant Seagrass communities. They're very complex organisms. Even though they just look like blades on the ground, they have a very complex life history. I've been working on seagrasses for over 20 years. I have never seen a seagrass flower, but they are out there. There's male and female plants. They have a very complex life history. They go through seed and germination. And the interesting thing about seagrasses is that because they're clonal, they reproduce sexually and asexually like most plants. A seagrass bed can in fact be hundreds of years old. The same genotype can be present within a given environment for hundreds of years. Okay, that's very interesting, much like corals. So what do they need? They're rooted plants, so they need sediments to be able to take a hold of the bottom. Okay, much like any other terrestrial angiosperm, any other terrestrial plant, they need sediments to root. So anytime you remove the sediments, you're removing a very essential requirement for seagrasses. So think about beach renourishment and dredging projects that move sediments around. You remove the sediments, you remove a really important habitat component for seagrasses. They require a lot of light. They have some of the highest light requirements of all submerged macrophytes, more than microalgae, more than macroalgae, more than mangroves. So what does that mean in terms of water quality? If you need a lot of light, you need water clarity. You need the light to be able to go through the water column and reach the seagrass canopy. So anything that affects water clarity will influence the abundance, distribution, and condition of seagrasses. So think about the things that we do locally and globally to modify water quality: nutrients, sedimentation, boating activities. All of those activities that modify light penetration influence seagrasses negatively. They need some protection from physical disturbance. They're good at trapping sediments, but nevertheless, they need some protection. Otherwise, storms will basically just wash them away. They need stable salinity, and they need oxygen. All plants need oxygen, even though they give out oxygen. So this is the typical seagrass morphology. And the reason why I'm showing this, and I didn't have enough time to go get some nice seagrass, but you can pass these around. I just picked them up from a beach, Key Biscayne. The crucial thing about their morphology, again, they look like just any other grass on land, is that the green portions, which is what you see when you go out boating, snorkeling, or paddleboarding, the green portions, the photosynthetic portions, are just a small fraction of the total biomass that seagrasses have. More than 2/3 of the carbon that's stored within seagrass communities is stored below the sediments. You don't see those. And when you look at the rhizomes that I'm passing around, you will see that the root rhizomes are actually very meaty. They're thick. They store a lot of carbon. So the below ground biomass often exceeds the above ground biomass. Much like an iceberg, what you see is just a fraction of what's there. The same for seagrasses. They are extremely productive, some of the fastest turnover rates of any macrophyte or plant community in the world. What that means is that they produce a lot of dead material, and we spend a lot of money taking those dead rhizomes and dead leaves away from our beaches. Okay, that just shows you that on a daily basis, they produce a tremendous amount of biomass. Okay, we don't want to have them on our beaches, but nevertheless, that biomass is food for organisms. Huge productivity. A seagrass blade that's attached to a seagrass plant is probably there for about 14 days before it's shed, and then a new leaf comes in. When you go boating, you see these long lines of floating seagrass. Those are all dead, detached seagrass blades. Huge amount of productivity. They stabilize sediments very well. This is a side view taken in the Keys. This is about 1 meter high. So when you remove the plant material because of a boating accident, a grounding, or a storm, you can see how much sediment these root rhizome sections trap. You remove the seagrasses, all of those sediments are washed away by currents and storms. Okay, very, very important in binding sediments, which is crucial for us because we want to keep our beaches in place. We don't want to have to be restoring are sand all the time. So they trap sediment in place, which is very, very important. But maybe the most important service they provide to humans is carbon sequestration and trapping and nutrient filtering and trapping. Okay, these numbers are a bit low because they're kind of old, about 20 years old. But it was estimated that an acre of seagrass is worth over $30,000 to humans. And the value comes from, again, sequestering carbon, trapping carbon from the atmosphere and the ocean, and then turning it into biomass, and also trapping nutrients. They're very good at cleaning the water. The nitrogen that's input into coastal environments because of eutrophication, sewage, storms, and water management, those nutrients are trapped very quickly and very efficiently by seagrasses. So they filter the nutrients, they soak up the carbon, and they trap the sediments. Those are very important values that they provide, services that they provide to humans. They also provide essential habitat for a whole bunch of organisms. When you core a seagrass bed, when you go in there with a shovel, you can see that hundreds, if not thousands, of different organisms make a living within the root rhizome system, the roots of seagrasses. These are all very important microorganisms. They provide food for the fish we catch. And if you look at the canopy, a huge, complex trophic structure is based on the productivity that seagrasses provide. A very complex food web is based on seagrass. A very important role they play within South Florida and in the Caribbean is their nursery habitat for very important fishery species. That's where you find the juvenile lobsters, the juvenile conch, juvenile reef fish, even small parrotfish are found in the seagrass beds. So some of you may know this, others probably not, but some of the key fisheries taxa, like lobsters, pink shrimp, it's a really good example. They go through what's called an ontogenetic migration. They spawn as adults, they reproduce as adults out in the reefs, sometimes as far as the dry tortugas. Then the larvae get carried by the currents, and some movement they're able to do themselves into the coastal bays. So Biscayne Bay, Florida Bay, those are important fisheries nursery grounds. So the juveniles make their way into the seagrass beds where they stay for protection and food for months. And then when they reach subadult size, then they move back out onto the reefs, and then eventually they reach their spawning grounds. So the seagrasses are crucial pit stops in this migration that some very important fish and invert species go through within their life cycle. So again, reef fish, snappers, grunts, things that we like to catch and eat. Pink shrimp, huge commercial catch in Florida. Lobsters and conch, all require, for part of their lifetime, a seagrass habitat to survive. Because they're plants, there's herbivores, grazers that depend on the biomass that these organisms provide. Sea turtles, one of the main grazers, or at least historically, one of the main grazers on seagrass is not as abundant today as they were before. Manatees, and there's also the organisms, the apex predators that feed on these grazers. Okay, so very complex food structure. Something that's not known, again, it's because they don't get a good PR, is that seagrass habitats around the world are declining at the same rate, if not faster, than coral reefs. Everybody knows about the coral reef crisis, the fact that coral reefs around the world are declining quickly, pretty much everywhere. Seagrasses, they're undergoing the same decline that coral reefs, salt marshes, and mangroves are. It's about a couple of soccer fields lost every minute around the world of seagrasses because of different reasons, and we'll talk about some of the disturbances that influence seagrass abundance and distribution. Nevertheless, they're important, not that you know already. They're also critically endangered as a habitat because they're being lost at increasing rates. What are some of the threats to seagrass beds, and some of these are very important locally, and that's why I have these pictures. Boat scarring, boat groundings, propeller damage, anchor damage. These are the major physical sources of stress to seagrass beds, locally and globally. Okay? Everybody that's ever driven a boat has run aground or at least touched a seagrass bed. It's impossible not to. Why? Because they're very shallow. Why are they shallow? Now you know, because they require light. Okay? So they're pretty much where people want to go with their boats. So scarring is very, very common. You can look at Google Earth, look to any of the shallow bays or banks in Florida, and you will see hundreds, if not thousands, of scars of different sizes and shapes. This is an example from our own backyard. This is a study we did in beautiful Masta Flats. You really can't see these very well, but so this is just a side view looking from offshore into the houses over there. And you can see that some moron was trying to write his or her name, or at least doing loops in the seagrass. So there's loops being carved out of the seagrass habitat by people going shallow and driving their boats over seagrass. When we mapped the seagrass scars using satellite images and GIS, we found over 700 scars. I don't know if you can make them out. So these are the Masta Flats. This is the seagrass in green. These are the sandy flats where people put their boats for the regattas. Every single one of these red scars is a seagrass scar. Okay, over 700. It's not a huge area, but it's a huge number of scars. So this is a major problem. Some of these scars recover over time. Some stay there for decades. If you again go to Google Earth, you can go back to the 1930s and 40s and look at the same area, and you will see that some of those scars still remain 50, 60 years later. So seagrasses sometimes recover very quickly, others don't recover at all. Nutrients. We talked about the importance of nutrients. To seagrasses, like any other plant, they need nutrients to survive. However, too much nutrients in the water column are a problem for seagrasses. Why? Because there's other things that grow faster than seagrasses. Bacteria grow faster than seagrasses. Epiphytes that grow attached to the seagrass leaves, microalgae and macroalgae grow faster than seagrasses. So they can coat the seagrass blades and pretty much remove any light reaching the surface of the blades. So they can pretty much stop photosynthesis for seagrasses. So nutrients are a major problem. So this is what a healthy, diverse seagrass bed looks under low nutrient conditions. This is pretty much the same type of environment under high nutrient conditions. The difference is that now the blades are completely coated by other organisms that take the light away from the seagrass blades. So nutrients are a major, major problem. Excess nutrients are a problem for seagrass beds. So anything we do on land that increases the input of nutrients to nearshore environments will be a problem for seagrass beds. In Florida, one of the major sources of nutrients is sewage, runoff from urban activities, and golf courses. And where do we have a golf course just adjacent to a shallow seagrass bed? In Key Biscayne. We did a survey in Key Biscayne, and we found that, and I'll show you some points later on, that the seagrass communities in the area where the nutrients from the golf course enter the shallow environments look more like the bottom picture than they do the top picture, which shows a clean, low nutrient environment. So we are modifying the nearshore environments by dumping nutrients into them. So seagrasses of Florida. Again, low diversity. So if you want to study seagrasses, it's very simple. All you got to do is learn 3 or 4 species and you're set. If you want to study corals, over 100. Fish, over a couple hundred. So very simple system to study. Florida has about 10% of the world's seagrasses. It's a huge amount, just South Florida. Over 150,000 kilometers square of seagrass coverage in South Florida alone. If you look at Key Biscayne, and this is the study that I mentioned before, where we had a student take random points and did some visual surveys looking for seagrass abundance and distribution patterns. And so this is up in our website, the Citizen Science Project, open to the public. You can go in there, you can look at this map, and you can click any of those points, and it will show you a picture of what the seagrass communities, or whatever's there, looks like. This just happens to be a sponge that's found within a seagrass community in the offshore areas of Key Biscayne. So when you do that, if you go to the areas that are influenced by the outflow of nutrients from the golf course, you will visually see, you will be able to tell that the seagrass communities over there look different from adjacent areas that are not influenced by the nutrients. Okay? So I really do welcome you guys to go into the website. We also have similar maps for mangroves and coral reefs. All of our local resources are being mapped, and we have examples of cool images that are tied to a location. Okay, so 3 or 4 species. Turtle seagrass, Thalassia testurinum, the most abundant seagrass species in the Caribbean and in South Florida. That's the broad-bladed species that we see all over the place. Manatee grass, Serengonium. This is the long, spaghetti-looking seagrass that washes up on shore. That's what I gave you guys to pass around. Again, very, very common in Key Biscayne and South Florida. Finally, Haloduliride, which is the thinnest of the 3 species, very thin blades, about 2 millimeters across. Also very abundant in Key Biscayne and elsewhere. And finally, how many of you guys know what Halophila johnsoni is or represents? Halophila johnsoni is the only endangered seagrass species in the Americas, and it happens to be found here in North Biscayne Bay. It was classified as endangered about 15, 20 years ago, and this is a major problem for construction projects, because whenever you have an endangered species in the area you want to mess with, then you have to go through an extra layer of permitting. So people that want to dredge, build docks, build houses along the shoreline. If johnsoni is found within the footprint of your project, you're in trouble. Which may be a good thing. But there's an emerging issue with this. Again, this was classified as endangered about 20 years ago. More recent evidence kind of shows that it may not be an endangered species, and it's only found in North Biscayne Bay in a small patch in deep, murky water, and we only find female plants. Okay, so that's enough to classify it as endangered. The problem is that molecular techniques have shown that it's actually not an indigenous species, but it's more related to Pacific species. Okay, so it may turn out that what we have classified as an endangered species is actually an invasive that came in, God knows how, maybe somebody dumped an aquarium or came in ballast water, and it's just found in North Biscayne Bay because that's the only place it can make a living. Anywhere else is outcompeted. So this is not the same story as the lionfish because it hasn't gone anywhere, but it may be similar in terms of the introduction of invasive species. And it has huge implications for development. Okay, developers would love to say that this is not a threatened or endangered species, but it's an invasive species, so it needs to be removed. Okay, this may actually be an issue with the Port of Miami dredging. As the dredging activities now move inshore, if they find Halophila in their surveys, they are screwed. Okay, so invasive means that it came from somewhere else. It's not native to the area, like the lionfish. They were brought in from the Pacific. So something to keep our ears on for the dredging programs in Florida. Okay, so what can we do? We damage the seagrasses with our boats. Is there anything that we can do to recover these scars that sometimes remain for decades? Okay. A lot of money, especially in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, which is in Monroe County, is spent restoring seagrass scars. Okay. When you damage natural resource in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and there's a recovery, they take you to court, They've done this with when runs aground in the Keys, and then they recover fees from the insurance companies. The requirement is that those fees are spent on restoration and monitoring. Okay, so sometimes there's huge pots of money to restore damaged seagrass habitats, but more often than not, these groundings are very small. We see people, when they run aground, and instead of waiting for the tide to go up, they just power through, lifting mud and seagrass. So those scars that you see normally in the flats are rarely attributed to a given individual. So it's hard to recover fees from somebody that doesn't stick around, who hasn't lost half of their lower unit. So what can we do? People have used seeds. Some seagrass species flower very commonly, and you can collect seeds, and you can basically just plant the seeds that you would plant any other species. That seems to work for temperate species. Sostra, which is a very common species up north of Florida, starting in the Carolinas and going all the way up the east coast of the US. They do very well from seeds. You can basically replant a whole bed with seeds very efficiently. The species that we have here in South Florida, I mentioned that I never seen a flower. They're very hard to collect as seeds. So we don't have that option for the three main species that make up the seagrass communities of Key Biscayne and South Florida. What people have done is basically seagrass restoration the same way you do hair restoration. You take from a donor site, and then you plant it somewhere else. You take it from the sides, you plant it on the top. The same thing is being done for seagrasses. And you can plant a very small shoot, just a fraction of what I showed you guys, or what you guys are passing around, or you can plant big plugs if you can get them. Okay, this is very, very common. We have done it in my lab, and other folks do it regularly. It's very time consuming, it's very expensive because you got to take equipment out in the water. So the goal is for these plugs eventually to grow into each other and form a dense seagrass bed. With time, they do. People have gone to extremes, and there's now a couple of outfits in the Keys that go beyond just hand collecting and hand planting. They have mechanical devices that collect and plant as they go. This is just one example, which is the Jeb. There's another contraption that can basically pick up a 2 by 2 meter square piece of the bottom and plant it somewhere else. The problem is, this works. Okay, that's not a problem. This works, but it's extremely expensive. Look at the cost. $45,000 to $250,000 per acre to replant a damaged seagrass bed using any of these methods. Seems like a lot of money, but remember that the services they provide on a yearly basis, over a few years, you make up that cost. But it's extremely time consuming. This is usually done by consulting firms, which are not cheap. There's a cheaper option out there that is not as fast, but again, if you don't have the resources, this is one way to go. Sometimes nutrients, I mentioned nutrients over and over again, nutrients limit the growth or the regrowth of some of these seagrass scars. Okay, good seagrass is usually found in low nutrient environments. So if you want them to grow fast, you need to add nutrients to the environment. People have done it in different ways. The seagrass scars are often filled with these sediment tubes that are filled with nutrient-rich sediments. So you can basically do a twofer. You fill up the scar and you add sediments to the bottom. That's been very effective in the Keys. But more commonly and more recently, people have switched to using bird stakes. And we have bird stakes all around Key Biscayne. You must have seen them driving into the Key and driving out of the Key. Bird stakes are now the low-cost, preferred method for restoring seagrass beds. And what do bird stakes do? Why do we use bird stakes, which are basically T-bars where birds can perch? Why do they work in restoring seagrass habitats? I'm going to ask you guys, the young ones. What do birds do? Say it.
They poop like...
Yeah, they poop. Birds are very good at pooping. Okay? So if you keep a bird at home, you have to change the paper under the cage all the time. They poop, and they poop a lot. What's in bird poop?
Nutrients.
Okay, what type?
Bird seeds.
What type? Specifically, people collect bird poop for a reason, and it's a huge industry in some countries. What do they have? Phosphate. Who said that? All right. Thank you. Phosphorus. Phosphorus or phosphate is the limiting nutrient in our environment. Our carbonate sediments, our sands, soak up phosphorus more so than they do any other nutrient. So our waters tend to be P, which is phosphorus, limited. So anytime you add phosphorus, you're fertilizing the other water and you're enhancing the growth of seagrasses. So that's what birds do. And they're very effective at doing that. So we're now actually thinking about using bird steaks in the Mashta Flats to recover some of those 700 scars that have been there for a long, long time. Okay, so I'm going to be wrapping up. So again, this is what I want you guys to take away from this very brief lecture. Seagrasses are beautiful. Seagrasses are very valuable. Seagrasses are threatened and endangered. They provide significant services to humans, mainly carbon sequestration. Blue carbon is very much in fashion these days. A lot of people pay a lot of money for blue carbon projects. That's basically a way to soak up carbon from the atmosphere and the ocean, storing it somewhere where it's not available. It won't cause acidification. It won't cause all of the problems that low pH cause in the ocean. They're very abundant around Key Biscayne, and they're very important to preserve. So the question is, what can you do? And I'm going to give you a couple answers. You may have some others. Okay? Follow boating rules. Again, physical damage to seagrasses is the major source of mortality. So don't let your parents run over seagrass. Okay? Take the time to go around through the channels, into deeper areas. Yeah, they're grass. Yeah, they'll grow back, but they're very important components of the coastal ecosystems of South Florida. So be mindful of the seagrasses. Don't throw garbage. That's a given. We have very good citizens like Jose who picks up garbage. Pick up garbage when you see it in the shallow environments. Okay? And finally, educate your friends and family. Nobody seems to know much about seagrasses. Now you guys know. Okay, so go home and educate your parents and your friends about the value of seagrasses. That's it from me. If you have any questions about my research or anything that I presented, I'll be around for a while. We'll do the selfies. Thank you.